My name is Mike Boehm. I'm the Vice Chancellor for the Institute of Ag and Natural Resources and the Vice President for Ag and Natural Resources for the University of Nebraska System. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our first Heuermann Lecture of the 2017-2018 academic year. The theme of this season's Heuermann Lecture Series is really about thinking globally and acting locally. I think at the university we both think and act globally and think and act locally, but this notion of what happens around the world and its impact on Nebraska, our past, our present, and our future is the theme we've gone with today. The Heuermann Lectures in the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources are made made possible by Keith and Norma Heuermann and the Heuermann family. Keith has joined us with some of his family members. Keith, would you mind standing so we can say thank you? As I'm getting around Nebraska, just last month I had quite a privilege. It was a neat day where I was able to stop at Keith's place and Phillips and sit and have a cup of coffee and talk about Keith and his journey, and we went out and took our picture right there in front of the old popcorn sign. So it was really amazing, and I will tell you how humbling it was to listen to Keith's journey and his story, and so thank you very much for making this possible. We're in our 7th season, so this is pretty exciting as we go. We are not only joined by each other in the auditorium, but this Heuermann Lecture is being live streamed, and if you have questions on after our speaker gives her comments, you can reach us, text your questions to hashtag HLSseries, and we will get those questions asked. The format for today's session will be to hear from Dr. Lourdes Gouveia, who will give a 40 to 50 minute presentation followed by 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A. For those in the space, we'll have 2 roving microphones, and just raise your hand and we'll get a microphone. We ask that you use the microphone so that those that are watching and engaging via the virtual link will be able to hear your questions and our responses. So let me introduce Dr. Lourdes Gouveia. Professor Lourdes Gouveia specializes in migration and Latin American development. In 2003, she co-founded the Office of Latino / Latin American Studies at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, which she directed until recently in August 2015. She is currently Professor Emerita of Sociology at UNO, where she still does teach with a graduate concentration on migration, development, and citizenship, this program that she created while at UNO. Her earlier work focused on global restructuring of the food industry, particularly meat processing, and the importation of Mexican and Central American labor as a critical component on that restructuring process. She is also a visiting professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Kansas in Lawrence. Among the publications spawned by this research was the edited volume, From Columbus to ConAgra, The Globalization of Food and Agriculture, that recently was published from the University of Kansas Press. Lourdes has co-authored or authored a number of articles aimed at documenting the profound socio-demographic changes and processes of immigrant incorporation occurring in new destination states such as Nebraska. As the director of the center at UNO, Lourdes was charged with the task of producing a number of very policy-relevant reports, issues, papers, which often were used as key evidence by Nebraska unicameral members as they went about their business. One of the latest reports entitled Latinos Throughout the City, a snapshot of socio-demographic differences in Omaha, Nebraska, was recently released. Lourdes's current work focuses on an entirely different migrant stream, the growing exodus of middle-class, highly educated Venezuelans. This work is situated within the context of an ever-increasing global shift of skilled and unskilled laborers alike, and the compounded impact of Latin America's failed development and governance models. It is really a pleasure to have Lourdes here, and I will just say that as each of you think about your own journeys and your family's journeys, I will say one of the observations for me as a new Nebraskan is I've never been in a place around the world that describes themselves, or folks introduce themselves as being a fifth generation or a sixth generation Nebraskan. My own family, my grandmother came from Bari, Italy. On my mom's side, my relatives come from the Netherlands, and my father's family, 2 generations removed, from Slovakia. So it's very easy for me to connect, and I've been quite impressed with communities such as Scotts Bluff that was based on migration. 5th, 6th generation migration. As you drive through, there's a Swede capital, a Czech capital. And as you think about Lincoln and Omaha and the new migration, and that has occurred just in recent years, Nebraska is a state that is founded on migration. Some of our communities seem to have embraced this from the very start. Some are struggling. Some have found a new way. And today we get to listen to Lourdes and her insights. So without further ado, Lourdes, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. It's a wonderful view to see you all sitting here in this beautiful auditorium. Thank you, Mike, and thank you to the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources for your invitation. And thank you so much to the Huerman family and Keith Huerman for this wonderful gift that you have endowed the university with. And thanks for placing this topic in this year's series. What I'm going to do today is present the very broad contours of what I call the making of Immigrant Nebraska, a work in progress for sure, which began about 155 years ago. And what Michael was saying is perfect. It's a perfect introduction and preface to what I'm going to be talking about. I will be drawing on my research as well as others' research on the topic of migration and immigration and meatpacking to Nebraska, and a number of reports like the ones Mike mentioned produced by Ollas, media stories, and census data. Inevitably, there is a lot that it will be left out in these very broad overviews of something as vast and multidisciplinary, but as migration, but hopefully we'll have time at the end for questions and clarify some of the points that you may want me to elaborate on. So, immigrants and their descendants have played a major role in the making of Nebraska for the past 155 years. Depending on where one draws the line, there have been at least 2 discernible waves of newcomers to the state. Early arrivals were recruited or lured by government and railroad agents to come and settle a territory which, as we all know, had already been settled. And that's the poster. Several thousand Native Americans from different nations or tribes inhabited what became the Kansas-Nebraska Territory in 1858. Most of their lands were soon turned into public and private lands and made available for free or for very little cost to the newcomers, overwhelmingly European immigrants and their descendants of earlier colonial waves. The question posed by the title of my presentation, if not immigrants, who, is merely a device or a particular lens through which I can re-examine that history. My intent is to bring into focus the social, political, and economic architectures upon which the formation of each of these immigrant waves rested, sort of the geology of migration. These building blocks, if you will, of staggered migration systems that have sustained the development of the state, as you will see, don't necessarily last forever either. So one might ask, if not immigrants, then who were the farmers and workers targeted to develop the Kansas-Nebraska territory, and who wasn't? Who was targeted for recruitment when jobs had to be filled in the sugar beet, railroad, or meatpacking industries, and who wasn't? Who among newcomers stayed, who left, and why? And importantly, for our final reflections, who is or is not included in the formulation of innovative policies? I thought I'd put the word innovative in an innovation comments, and development strategies for the future. Before I outline this architecture and forces, let me show you two graphs that show this major migrant wave. So it's, if you can see what I'm seeing, you see this major wave that started in the 1860s. European migration, it had two major streams. Some people divide it into three waves, but really for Nebraska, it was like a continuous wave. And then it drops down to almost nothing in 1970s, only to start back up. And this is the new wave. And we are gonna talk about it. And here's another look. This is in total numbers. Well, I wanted to show you that by 1870, 25% of the Nebraska population was foreign-born. And this is another way to look at the waves, and it's in absolute numbers. So at the peak of Nebraska immigration, back in 1870, there were almost twice as many immigrants as there are now. And this is all foreign-born, and this later wave is Latino foreign-born. Now, what's interesting, again, is that you see that the growth lately is not just Latinos, but it's actually other, and particularly Asian. So, migration into the United States and to Nebraska specifically has largely resulted from periodic changes in the demand for labor or settlers. Labor migration theorists like Alejandro Portes have successfully argued that there are at least three fundamental conditions which must be present for new labor streams to form. One is that there must be a demand for their labor. Two, that demand must be effectively known to prospective migrants or effectively communicated. And three, opportunities must be perceived by those prospective migrants as desirable. And this is relative to their own conditions at home, to their aspirations, and so forth. In addition, the sustainability of migration streams hinges not just on periodic recruitment by prospective employers or government agents, but on the development of dense social networks of family and kin, but also on what sociologists of migration have called the industry of migration, a new name for something that has existed forever, which is all those people, brokers, transportation agents, notary publics, smugglers, lenders, anybody that actually began to be pulled into the business of supporting a burgeoning migration network. So shops and so forth. Somebody was telling me how Fremont, I think, Jill, Fremont is getting ready for a new Costco plan, and already new shops are beginning to appear. Although I don't know who they're waiting for because they have a Starbucks there, so we'll see. So once in place, let me back up a second. One example that that illustrates how back then as now these networks were so important is that on the eve of World War I, nearly 80% of European immigrants had a relative waiting for them when they disembarked or came across. And another 15 were joining friends. Once in place, the social networks and the whole migration system tends to endure long after the initial motivations for migration are no longer there. But as I said earlier, these migration systems can also wane, and you saw that in the graph, and eventually come down to a trickle. What migration scholars call the positive context of reception also play a much more important role in the successful incorporation of these immigrants than do immigrants' places of origins or their own personal attributes. What they bring with them, I used to tell my students when I was teaching immigration at the lower level, I said, what they bring with them is not as important to make it in America as to what they find in the context of reception in the communities where they settle. Context of reception, when positive, include job availability, decent wages, laws and policies which facilitate their entry and citizenship or permanence, and in general, a welcoming environment where political leaders and bureaucrats on the ground extend rather than limit the right to belong. In her study about citizenship in Midwestern states during the early part of the 20th century, Elaine Bloemrad concluded that out of all the factors she looked at, which included weaker bureaucratic barriers, immigrants' English proficiency, the alleged propensity of some groups to mobilize more than others, and the presence of or absence of restrictionist immigration laws or restrictionist laws for immigrants, it was the latter that had the most profound effect on naturalization rates, on people actually then becoming permanent citizens or permanent members of their societies. 90% of German immigrants, for example, in Ohio in 1900, a state which had not restricted occupational licenses, which are very important, to citizens, were 90% of them were naturalized immigrants. This compared to only 60% of their compatriots in Wisconsin. As the author of this research put it, the stick of restrictive laws might drive naturalization or citizenship less than the carrot of a friendly environment. Stuff to keep in mind as I go on. I will highlight next, in a very compressed way, in a very rapid historical overview, some key elements in the context of arrival and belonging that characterize each and all of these immigrant waves which have contributed to the making of Nebraska. I devote then some additional time to the examination and outcomes of the latest wave, which began to form in the 1980s, that smaller wave that you see at the end, and conclude with some reflections about current challenges and alternative ways to think about the question, if not immigrants, who? This is such a broad history, and I was telling somebody in lunch today, I feel like, Nebraskans have learned so much about immigration, I have so little to teach. But then I thought about Andre Gide, and I'm paraphrasing, everything has been said before, but since we forget, we have to keep going back and beginning all over again. So since I forget myself, this was great for me to be able to review all of this. The allure of free and inexpensive land for masses of poor European peasants, craftsmen, and wage workers displaced by industrialization, and the concomitant demand for labor in the US grew in earnest after the Homestead Act of 1862 and as railroad labor recruitment accelerated. As we saw in the earlier graphs, by 1870, fully a quarter, 25% of the population of Nebraska was born in a foreign country. Danes, Swedes, all the review that Mike was going over, Irish, Czechs, among others, arrived with these earlier waves of migrants. The demand for the labor of immigrants was communicated through the different mechanisms I described earlier, that industry of migration, all those networks, family letters, including foreign language posters and newspapers such as the one that I'm showing here, which is a Nebraska Czech newspaper. There were about 50 foreign language newspapers in Nebraska back then, in the 19th century and in the 1900s. These early newcomers created family farms, and by the end of the 19th century had turned Nebraska into the nation's 4th largest producers of corn, as well as a major supplier of cattle and sugar. Their inputs fueled the growth of crop and beef processing factories later on. By the turn of the century, it was the demand for menial or semi-skilled labor that was growing, particularly in urban areas and in the increasingly industrialized agri-food sector. By 1907, for example, the US Senate's Diligence Commission estimated that more than 80% of meatpacking workers in Omaha were first or second generation immigrants. Southern and Eastern Europeans were most heavily represented in this labor stream: Italians, Poles, Lithuanians, Greeks, as well as newer arrivals of Russian Germans and Czechs. Smaller streams of Mexicans, as well as Japanese and Chinese, were also joining this great migration, along with African Americans from the South. Easy access to land clearly qualified as a positive context of reception for the earliest arrivals, and so did immigration policies during the entire 19th century. US borders had remained largely open until 1924. Only about 2% of immigrants arriving in Ellis Island had been excluded, primarily the infirm, feeble-minded, and so forth, and those considered most likely to become a public charge. First and second-class passengers who arrived in New York harbors underwent a cursory inspection, the thinking being that if they could afford to purchase a first or second-class ticket, they were unlikely to become a public charge. So then, like now, if you're very wealthy, you can get yourself a good visa to enter the United States. Right now, there is such a thing. There were no visas, but they just entered more easily. Upon entry, citizenship rights were also relatively accessible public goods. The Homestead Act, for example, specified that homesteaders had to be citizens of the United States or simply declare their intention to become citizens in order to be able to take advantage of the land grants. There was also relatively lax implementation of naturalization laws, which until 1906 were in the hands of state and local judges who had a great deal of latitude when deciding on citizenship petitions from anyone. Proof of residence was often minimal, was waived or forged. Local government and political actors were often also recruited to help with citizenship processes of arriving immigrants. As Stephen Eyre has put it, quote, immigrants fresh off the boat were given red tickets by New York's Naturalization Bureau, allowing them to get their citizenship papers free. And they would take these tickets to Tammany Hall, which was the Democratic Party headquarters, those, corrupt Democrats, I'm kidding, paid the required court fees and provided false witness testimony that these immigrants had been here for 5 years, which was the required residence stay that you had to have for citizenship. That reality belies today's myth about some fictitious line for today's immigrants to get behind. The myth that citizenship can be had if you just get in line, wear your turn, speak English, and go get citizenship. That idea, this myth that has developed so profoundly today, that you see people saying all the time, comes from those earlier memories that we have now forgotten. It happened in a very different context. Chris Gouveia Kansas Secretary of State, we can talk about him later if you want, knows better. But speaking about the precarious situation of DACA students, recently told the Washington Post just that, quote, when they asked him, so what would you do with these DACA students whose temporary status is being rescinded, this deferred action for children, I forget the last word, what it means. Then he answered, I would suggest they go home and get in line. Come into the United States legally, then get a green card, then become a citizen. Simple enough. However, the context of reception began to change dramatically for these older Europeans by the late 1800s, when Asians were barred from buying land by some states, including Nebraska, and a sequence of federal laws barred Asians from acquiring citizenship and entering the country altogether. This sequence of legislative activity culminated with the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, which also established onerous quotas limiting the entry of Southern and Eastern Europeans, those last arrivals. And that's when you see that wave going, it begins to wane profoundly. While Southern and Eastern Europeans had often been viewed as ambiguously white, to use a term by historian Roderick, the wrath against Asians was particularly furious. In 1893, responding to requests for a stay of what may have been our first travel ban, the Supreme Court opined, if the government of the United States considers the presence of foreigners of a different race in this country to be dangerous to its peace and security, their exclusion is not to be stayed, because at the time there are no actual hostilities with the nations of which these foreigners are subject. And then added that war would simply make the travel ban more obvious and pressing. Race entered the whole discussion of deserving, not deserving, legal, illegal, right at this time with enormous force, of course, coming from that dichotomy of the United States seeing its population as black and white and now being complicated by new immigration, so a lot of these people became racialized as well. Somebody had to fit in some category, white and non-white. So you see Irish sometimes being treated as non-whites, even getting very negative court rulings because they were not considered white. Or you see Germans, or of course Jews and Asians. And in this process, some people were able to finally pass and become white, but some others have had a much harder time and maybe don't want to. Restrictionist policies which divide families across borders and interrupt well-established labor migration systems or family networks inevitably create their own flows of immigrants entering or staying without authorization. In 1925, the Immigration Service reported 1.4 million immigrants living in the country without authorization. Mirroring what was happening nationally, the climate in Nebraska became increasingly unwelcoming for different groups at different times and for complex reasons. In the early 1900s, the masses of new immigrants were being deemed unassimilable and unwilling to learn English. World War I, economic downturns, and labor competitions hardened anti-immigrant sentiments. In 1919, Nebraska was the first state to pass a law aimed primarily at Germans, but affecting everyone, prohibiting the use of a foreign language in schools. The law was ruled unconstitutional and rewritten to be later included in the state's constitution, where I believe it still is part of the Constitution, Article 27, you can look it up. Local agencies and actors on the ground can exercise enormous power in curtailing or amplifying citizenship rights. So it's not just federal law, but at the local level, there's a lot that can be done to deny, to curtail, to put into doubt somebody's rights of citizenship or belonging. And they do that in their daily practices and in encounters with immigrants. Such power could result in limiting access to basic services or jobs, or a failure to protect immigrants from exploitative work, conditions, and discrimination. Some civic organizations in Nebraska back then did exactly that. They engaged in extra-legal enforcement of the law that had been struck down by the Constitution. And these English-only laws have, again, enormous impacts in communities where people are still learning English and where older people and first immigrants never quite do very well. Hostility towards immigrants in Nebraska during the first part of the 20th century never appeared to reach, however, the level found in much larger cities. There were the Omaha race riots of 1919, resulting in the injury and death of African Americans and Greeks. Poles, but especially Italians and Greeks, were often described, again, as unassimilable, even by a noted sociologist who once wrote of Italians, quote, "made no effort to learn the language, and Greeks are absorbed with difficulty into Nebraska mainstream culture and society." So we've always had this, like Mike was saying, we've always had to navigate these kinds of newcomers and who belongs and who doesn't belong. Fertility rates then and now were also viewed as obstacles to assimilation. They have been invoked periodically to propose constitutional amendments which denied citizenship to presumably unassimilable children of immigrants, that second generation born in the United States. Quote, "although children born to immigrants are by definition natives, then their numbers and share they represent, the number and share they represent of all birds may have some bearing on how they assimilate. As a result, foreign cultural norms, values, and even identities may be dominant among these children." This is a quote from Stephen Camarota of a very ideologically minded Center for Immigration Studies of 2005. But you can read these almost exact quotes. I often think that they must be confusing history. In 1800s or 1900s. By 1965, when a new immigration policy eliminated the quota laws, only 5% of the states, or 2% of the state's population, was foreign-born. It was the end of the migration system, which began in the late 1800s. The state's economy was prosperous, and most immigrant groups had persevered or prospered as well. Some, like Greeks, had largely left the state. So this is what so less than 5%, you can see that graph. Keep that in mind because I'm going to show you then what it looks like now. And this was the largest ancestries of Nebraska as of today when the census asked that question, so German, Irish, English. And people have been asked this question for a long time. Interestingly enough, in the last census, the last two censuses, there have been less people willing to answer that question, something interesting to consider. Mexicans' presence in the state dates back to at least the early 1900s. They were actively recruited by sugar beet farmers and the sugar beet industry. I'm a little nervous about the time because I don't know what time it is. And how long?
Before, after?
How long do I have?
Another 20 minutes.
Okay, perfect. They were actively recruited by sugar beet farmers and the sugar beet industry, and they became the labor force of choice for repairing rail lines. These jobs soon became pejoratively known as Mexican jobs, a racialized job classification which signaled to white Europeans that those jobs were really beneath their status and expectations. And keep this in mind because it comes back later. Despite the itinerancy and seasonality of these jobs and at times hostile reception, a few families managed to tough it out in Nebraska communities like Scottsbluff and Minutair and Hershey. Later, some moved to Lexington, where I actually, when I was doing my field work there, met some of the families and came to love some of those families. The quota laws included in the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act did not include Mexicans. Mexicans were not affected by that law, although harsh entry requirements enforced by the newly created Border Patrol, also created that year, 1924, had major impacts on this historic migrant flow. Conversely, the exodus of Asians and Europeans from agricultural jobs made Mexican labor increasingly valuable to employers in those sectors, and that demand helped create and institutionalize a stable stream of unauthorized farm workers. Since then, or until recently perhaps, Mexicans have been by far the most precariously employed, criminalized, and persecuted immigrant group. About half were estimated to have been deported during the Depression of the 1930s. By the 1940s, Nebraska's Mexican population was cut by an equal proportion, by half. Relief agencies denied them services, actors on the ground, even when citizens, and pressured them to depart. And angry labor unions, beneath the popular banner of Hire American, turned against them as well. This is a quote, there's a quote from Minutair from 1941, and this is right in the middle of the war when It shall be unlawful for any person or persons of Mexican blood or race to purchase, lease, or occupy real estate lying north of the Niagara Street in said city and east of the public road on the east section line of Section 7. Yeah, so it was an ordinance, one of those ordinances that reappear once in a while. Mexican farm workers were again the labor agriculture force of choice during the Second World War years, and after the quota laws had put an end to rather short-lived, also this Pacific system of migration, which never quite burgeoned to the numbers that we have later for Asians. The presidents of Mexico and the US signed a bilateral guest working agreement in 1942, popularly known as the Bracero Program. The program was supposed to end with the return of men from the war, but the continued dependence of growers on Mexican labor had only deepened the program, and it was extended to 1964. It brought an average of 200,000 workers to the US, but had relatively little impact in Nebraska. The Mexican population in the state continued to grow at a relatively slow pace after the traumatic experience of the 1930s. From 1960 to 1970, Mexican immigrants in Nebraska, this is foreign-born, increased by 70% to a total of 2,700, not many, and grew at a much faster pace in the next decades. Natural increase, rather than new immigration, accounted for most of this population's growth during that post-1930s era. A second and third generation was more evident in Omaha and other towns where meatpacking plants had begun to replace dwindling pools of European labor with Mexicans and African Americans. Many scholars and analysts have credited the inefficient bureaucracy of the Bracero Program, as well as the fact that it ended and left everybody trapped on this side with no work authorization, as the reason why we've had such an explosive growth of unauthorized migration from Mexico in the last half of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century. By the early 1990s, a new wave of immigrants from Mexico, but also Central America, was beginning to take shape at an impressively fast pace. This wave was flanked at one end by a severe farm crisis caused by the collapse of the international grain markets, and on the other, by the deepening of the agro-industrial model driven by a new way of large restructuring agro-food industries as a way of getting out of the crisis. Over the course of the 20th century, the small family farms established by earlier European immigrants had given way to highly industrialized agriculture. Larger, more capital-intensive, and more concentrated feedlots and farms now specialized in fewer commodities for the domestic and global markets. As those international grain markets collapsed, something you probably know this story well, so did land values and farms. Between 1982 and 1987, just as 5 years, Nebraska farmers had filed more bankruptcies than any other state. The farm crisis accelerated the exodus of population, which had begun much earlier with the consolidation of capital-intensive agriculture. Decent jobs by small manufacturing plants like Sperry, New Holland in Lexington also disappears as farms collapse. The meatpacking industry had been experiencing its own crisis, and employment in that sector had also shrunk substantially since at least the early 1970s. To make a long story short, because I think you know a lot of this, a new breed of meatpacking companies led by IBP, now owned by Tyson, revolutionized the industry by implementing a number of changes. Important among those changes was relocating meatpacking away from urban centers and to the into the rural communities, many of which had been the ones that had gone through the farm crisis. The catch, of course, was that these were the same communities that had lost and continue to lose population at high rates. Meat processing companies are known for their PR campaigns, which promise to hire local companies within local workers within a 60-mile radius. However, they soon exhaust those dwindling pools of labor. In addition, most of these overwhelmingly white European workers or descendants are unwilling to risk or were unwilling to risk injuries with accelerating line speeds and are loath to work for flat wages and virtually non-existent career ladders, all the result of restructuring of the meatpacking industry. And I hope I'm forgiving if I'm insulting anyone. Importantly, much like railroad yard maintenance jobs decades earlier, meatpacking jobs soon became known as Mexican jobs. And research has shown that status of work, not just wages, has a lot to do with why people won't re-enter certain labor markets. Packing companies understand the labor market and are keenly aware of the fact that immigrants have been and will continue to be an industry staple. Agro-industries also understand how immigrant networks, recruitment, and immigration policies work. The new meatpacking labor supply was thus efficiently cobbled together from a combination of unauthorized workers that were left from the end of the Bracero Program, newly regularized workers from the Amnesty Law of 1986, IRCA, Immigration Reform and Control Act, new refugees from Vietnam or Central American, and other streams of Central Americans who were now authorized to work, only to work under a new status called the temporary protection status, the same status that was just rescinded for Haitians by the Trump administration, and which the Trump administration has promised to end for everyone. The availability of Mexican and Central American workers from labor-saturated California and crisis-ridden Latin America in the 1980s was effectively converted then into a seemingly endless labor supplies. Packing plants advertising in Spanish radio along Highway 80. I interviewed a lot of workers who told me these stories. Distributed flyers across state or the southern US border, enrolled expert teams of recruiters to organize informational gatherings, and offer bonuses to the hired workers in order to crank up network recruitment among families and friends. Eventually, like last century, word of mouth, letters did the rest. Now it's WhatsApp and text. When the supply tightened, buses were sent into Mexico where previous returnees, some of them US residents, were cajoled and enticed into returning. Bonuses were once again offered to anyone who brought their friends and families. By the mid-1990s, the architecture of this new migrant stream was firmly in place. Its future, somewhat uncertain. Between 1990 and 2000, population changes in the states were dramatic. I'm going to just show you these very quickly. Just look at the last two, where you see white population, in these towns. They changed from 1990 to 2000, very dramatic, and then see the increase in the proportion of Latinos and on the right. It was dramatic change. And here's that other map I was telling you. Now this is how the whole U.S. looks, and Nebraska now is about 77% or 9% foreign-born, so it joins a darker shade of states. And I don't know if I have that other, there is the previous one. This was in 1970 when that European wave went down, and then here again is what's happened to the US and Nebraska today. Again, something interesting that is happening, and I'm just gonna go through this very quickly, is that while a lot of these towns like Lexington, Schuyler, Grand Island, Sioux City, Crete, have gained a lot of population, that population is, immigrant population is diminishing. International migration is essentially net zero from Mexico, and the climate probably augurs another, I don't know, Pacific stream end. Refugees have been coming in, and this is why the Asian migration is a little higher. So you see the numbers of refugees settling in different areas. Asian migration, again, growing at a faster click. And many of them are being employed, have been employed in meatpacking plants, but what we know about refugee streams is that they also don't last forever in this kind of labor force. The context of reception has vacillated in Nebraska between negligent to positive to hostile to ambiguous, as we have it right now, with both very positive things going on, but very uncertain and openly hostile things going on. I can't read through all of this because I think I have how much time left?
7 minutes.
Okay, so we can come back to this, but essentially, we've vacillated between saying things like immigrants are important, and we agree that undocumented immigrants should be given a chance to stay, they have no criminal records and so forth, to moments where Latin American immigrants are not good for rural Nebraska. 2006 was a heavy year. Restrictionist bills were introduced in the legislature. There was that big Grand Island raid, among others. But there were also, and the DREAM Act had been introduced and not passed, which is the one that allows students to get in-state tuition. But it finally passed. And then in 2014, is that the right way to write that? Or Fremont, Nebraska, we've been talking to Jill, who's from Fremont, passed that ordinance that was modeled after Arizona law, SB 1070, that became known as the racial profiling law, and a whole slew of communities all over the country passed these ordinances. Many of them were struck down by the Supreme Court, or they came down to bare bones, including Fremont. And even Arizona was just finally said we can't handle these constant lawsuits anymore, and the judges ruled against their frisk and search and their very arbitrary stops, and so even Arizona has stopped. A lot of these laws were authored or co-authored and very much pushed by Chris Kobach, and have cost states and communities like Fremont millions of dollars to litigate. But then we have the new environment where the legislature has passed 2 bills supporting DACA students over the governor's veto, and so we have sort of a bifurcated political scenario in the state today where grassroots community members, churches, chambers of commerce, industry people are all about working to provide a more welcoming environment and supporting especially these undocumented students who are about to lose their status unless Congress passes a new bill. And then you have the governor and the attorney general here or in Nebraska very much against anything that is not enforcement of immigration law. There were some hate groups when I started doing this work that would follow us everywhere and disrupt talks such as these. They have weakened quite a bit, but there is an increasing reporting of hate crimes, although they seem to be by individuals. And of course, there are also anti-immigrant groups, primarily by white supremacist groups. And the Southern Poverty Law Center, which keeps track of these groups, it named 5 in its last report for Nebraska, and there were 3 when I started doing my work. But they don't appear to be the same people. But they are equally rattling. They rattle us. They rattle us because we live in a climate where we don't know who's going to do what. So these are some selective outcomes of this latest wave. What happened to this latest wave? You know, the first wave, family farms, great productive agriculture, agro-industry model, full force. Again, Nebraska sort of sorts itself out like every community with earlier newcomers and later newcomers, and out of that, voila, comes these wonderful realities, right? The place where we live, which really is very prosperous. I'm traveling through 75 and crossing from Kansas to Nebraska, quite the interesting change. It's a very pretty, prosperous state, Nebraska. Not that Kansas is not, but sorry, Bob. So the state of Nebraska and its agri-food sector recovered from the 1980s farm crisis. I'm sorry, there's not supposed to be a question mark there. Meatpacking restructuring paid off. Employment more than doubled between 1982 and 1996. And the industry has become highly concentrated, vertically integrated, global, and very profitable. Its labor supplies loosen and tighten, but it's full speed ahead, so to speak. Benefits to local communities are uneven, though harder to calculate. And I'm summarizing a lot of research, much of it, by the way, you can also find in the OYA's website, the Office of Latin American Studies at UNO, or email me. Immigrants' economic benefits to the state have been exhaustively documented, even by reports such as OYA's. We have done 2, which have been some of those reports that the legislature has used a lot. Every time an immigrant-related bill came up. In those reports, we can show that 17,000, 18,000 jobs were created in just in one particular year by immigrant investments in their communities and by their taxes and so forth. And losing that population would amount to something like 38,000 job losses. Mexicans, like their Italian counterparts earlier, have increased their English proficiency and levels of education, although they still remain low. Undocumented students under DACA performed especially well in a whole array of educational and socioeconomic indicators. The Migration Policy Institute, among many others, have a lot of data on how these students are performing because they have to register, because there's so much known about them. And because Migration Policy Institute and Pew Center are so good at estimating undocumented immigrants in the United States. Their data is phenomenal. Despite high levels of labor force participation, however, poverty and unemployment rates among Latinos of all generations continue to be at least 3 times as high as those of whites. So, in conclusion, I hope I didn't rush too much through some of that, but we can come back. Did I rush too much? In conclusion, I don't know if I succeeded, but one of underlying intent for this talk was to encourage all of us to take a retrospective look and appreciate how the making of Nebraska, its growth, its economic development, and cultural enrichment, along with the occasional battles for inclusive membership, has been a project of immigrants and their descendants, and of more immigrants and their descendants. There is little else. Immigrants are and will always be, whatever their populations, an intricate scaffold for continuing to build Nebraska society, its economy and its politics and its culture. But as Dimitri Papademetriou from the Migration Policy Institute I just cited, its former president, told us not too long ago, quote, "We have an unexamined habit of thinking that immigration has to be a free good. They just come here, let them find their own way. It's their problem, not mine. We're not going to invest in them." The state, its agro-industrial model, rural communities, and immigrants themselves are facing a number of challenges which will continue to require innovative, again, and this is the place to do it, right? Innovation commons, I'm serious about that. And democratic alternatives for local inclusion. To name a few, the state is facing challenges such as an aging population and rural communities experiencing a relentless brain drain of their young people. Latino youth are not immune from this trend. And those drops that you're seeing there are in part, those drops in Latino population, is that Latino youth are leaving the communities that 30 years ago they came to be born in with their parents who may be still there, but that new generation may not. In addition, the Mexico-US migration system formed around the turn of the 20th century may be coming to an end. And the globalized agro-industrial model is being questioned by local communities hoping for a more sustainable economic strategy. Tyson controversies all over, for example. Immigration policies are becoming increasingly restrictionist and punitive as well. All of this is to say that we need to listen to Papademetriou's words and invest in, not deport our youth. The question is not really then, if not immigrants, who? But if not with immigrants, with whom do we continue to build our communities? With whom do we continue to develop our state? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Lourdes, and thank you to the group. I was on the governor's trade mission to Japan a couple weeks ago, and we had an embassy brief, and it was just fascinating as I was thinking about my own journey here in Nebraska and thinking about this session. And what we learned was that, I think most of you know, Ronnie Green used to talk about it, by the year 2050, the projection is that we will have, on the planet, we'll go from 7 billion people to 9 billion people, give or take. In the US, I think our population is around 330 million, and our projection is around 360 million in that year 2050. In Japan, their population is just shy of 127 million today, and their projection in the next 50 years is to actually decrease from 127 million to 88 million. Japan will see a 33% decrease in their population. So here's where my mind was going. If we take the US and we take Japan, and we add them together today, our two countries will essentially have the same population. When the rest of the world's increasing by 2 billion, we're going to stay neutral. Pretty amazing statistic, and I couldn't help but reflect on some of what I was seeing there. Japan has a relatively low immigration. The role of women and families and choices that women make, very interesting dynamics. And just before dinner, probably not a very good statistic to share, but they did say that there are more adult diapers sold in Japan than there are baby diapers. Right? I mean, hit home, that's pretty rough. So I think as we think about going forward, the other statistic or the other number that I would throw in this is that map that Lourdes showed. Striking. I heard Dawn say about Lexington. What is that? You know, huge, over 1,400% increase. I think as we think about the U.S., half of the babies born in 2011 were white babies and half were babies of color. I use that example because everybody loves babies. But the truth of the matter is, if that was where we hit 50-50, and we think about the year 2029, for those of us in the university system, those students will be, those kids, those babies will be 18, and those babies will be engaging our universities. And those babies are the problem solvers. And if we flash forward, we use terms like majority-minority states. I think we have 7 majority-minority states in the U.S. now. The year 2045, or there's about 39 of our states will be majority-minority. So I think these conversations, as uncomfortable, I don't know about you, but as uncomfortable as it is, the story started relatively upbeat, and we saw that first wave, and my grandfather was in that first wave of German immigrants in Ohio. So we think about the past and where we've been, and we think about where we are today. I am hopeful, given the stories of Nebraskan communities, about where we're heading and with these demographic shifts. But I really think collectively this is a conversation that's worthy of having now, such that we can be proactive in our own communities and to advance Nebraska. So we'll open this up for questions, Q&A, and we have our first question right here.
Do you have a mic?
Hi, my name is Helen Fagan, and I'm actually a faculty, and I've got some of my students right here.
Great.
Thanks.
They're doing a research on the impact of diversity in rural communities. And so one of my questions is, based on recent discoveries from neuroscience about bilingual benefits of critical thinking and global competencies, what do you think is keeping us in Nebraska from changing the English-only law when we know that more than 50% of the students entering our schools in a few years will be minority students? How are we keeping ourselves from being able to compete on a global level when we know that the brains of those who speak more than one language work better?
It's a great question. You want me to answer?
Oh yeah, you're the expert.
No, you gave a great talk. First of all, I am not sure how many people here knew that this constitutional, it's not just a law, it's in the Constitution. How many people here knew that this is in the Nebraska Constitution? Okay, so 1-2 people maybe. So most people don't even know. So we go about our business as if it doesn't exist, right? And that means that, you know, on the ground, again, as I said, at the local level, people can do a lot. They can do harm, but they can do a lot of good. And I think that's what's happening. Because the good news on the other side of that is that Nebraska, in fact, I had that as the many examples and stories that I had to ditch in order to keep to some kind of timeline, is that Nebraska has been quietly, but successfully, even slowly, developing its dual language programs. You probably know that. And it's a success story like no other. And this is to the testimony of New York immigrants that ended up in Nebraska, and as a New Yorker, Susan Mayberger, appreciating the value of so many languages in especially in a globalizing economy. So we have that. But if we don't know these laws, if we don't have these conversations, if we don't understand how this happened, we don't work at changing our local context. And I think that's the lesson. There are a lot of people working very hard, but I do think that one not so great story about states like ours, but really the United States as a whole, is that we don't do English language teaching, English as a second language teaching accessible to new immigrants and to kids who grow up in non-English speaking schools. We don't do that very well. And there's a lot of data to show that. And this could be done a lot better. And it's a conversation I've had tons of times with philanthropists. And there are some great philanthropic organizations in Nebraska that are interested, but somehow maybe you, the new generations, can provide a catalyst.
I think Lourdes talked about awareness, and talks like today increased awareness. I also think, as we think about the University of Nebraska's programs that we have, with making sure or providing opportunities for our own students to be globally competent. I was just in China at the Northwest Ag and Forestry University, where we have 3 faculty teaching food science and technology in English. And those students are coming here, and someday I envision that the University of Nebraska will offer students a choice. Where would you like to do your 3rd year? Here in the US or in Yangling? And then you're globally competent, and you're now part of a multinational company that has got a footprint across the globe. These are really important, and it goes both ways. We have another question, Jesse? Yes, Mark.
Hi, yes. I was intrigued by your comments relative to the success of immigrants being it's more dependent on the community welcoming them. And I'm wondering if you have any reflection on how well we do that as a state, and if there are other states that do it better, what can we learn from them?
It's hard to generalize as a state and for every period. As I suggested, the climate worsens or improves depending often in external circumstances. Right now, we're in a very volatile political environment, nationally, globally, in the federal government, very anti-immigrant, very restrictionist. And that is making it hard. I actually think it's making it hard for politicians to be more proactive and to be more welcoming, because they have to run on the same tickets, of the president, to put it bluntly, who, is saying we're gonna, hire American, and that slogan comes from the 1800s or the 1900s. And so it's hard, but again, I think people on the ground are doing an enormously fantastic work. English is critical, and so I do think that that is one of the barriers that most affects social mobility. So that's one thing. And by the way, universities could do a lot more. So I want to put you all on the spot, because I tried to put UNO on the spot. You have an English as a second language program, right?
Yes.
But that English as second languages program that our taxpayers pay for are not for poor immigrants, are not for the millions of, neither here nor anywhere else, of non-English speaking workers who have a tough time moving from a meatpacking job to anything else, even voting, even working, participating politically and making their voice heard, because they don't have the opportunity after a very long day in a meatpacking plant to go work. Now, I know, for example, Excel in Schuyler has offered, but these are, sort of hit and miss opportunities. So I think that one of the things that we should lobby hard for is a return, but a benevolent Americanization program, not the very oppressive Americanization programs of, when anti-Germans and so forth, anti-German sentiment, but some kind of more committed and truly effective English language program. So that's one. The other thing is that communities could use spaces such as these, or the Community Engagement Center in Omaha, or their town halls, or their fairgrounds, to get together and not just discuss, as Tanganaxi is doing right now, saying, no to Tyson and so forth. And then everybody's wondering, is it because of the smell of the plant, just like we used to wonder in Lexington, or is it because they don't like chickens, or is it because they don't like immigrants? And so you have everybody in there. These are conversations that shouldn't happen when Tyson shows up. And these are conversations that should happen with everybody included. So inclusiveness, figuring out how to involve more. And this is happening. This, by the way, is happening. I know I have a lot of friends in organizations that are working hard at this, including more new immigrants. Remember, a lot of them are now second generation. They speak English, and they're speaking for their parents. Just like the earlier stories I heard about the earlier second generations. But more of that involvement is critical, and that involvement has to include, it has to change the narrative. It cannot just be about more jobs, more payrolls for us, more chickens, or more cows, or whatever it is. It has to be better wages, take care of our workers. They're not just immigrants, they're our community. If not immigrants, if not with immigrants, with who? They are us, So let's take care of them. Let's make sure that we're there watching to protect their rights, but also, protect them from injuries. And that can be done with employers a lot more. So far, employers are pretty tone deaf about a lot of the, they have their logic. They need to produce the chickens at, a zillion minutes an hour, or a zillion chickens an hour. Or beef or whatever, but they've been tone deaf in terms of the recommendations by scholars. They listen, they want to help, but they are trapped into that global competition. But I think communities can do a lot more. Sorry.
We've got another question.
Lourdes, I think you've done a wonderful job starting the dialect, opening the subject matter. I guess first an observation. And maybe a little more political in Nebraska. We had to work very hard to defeat two vetoes on DACA.
Right.
Actively, we're in other countries promoting our beef industry. We're #1 in cattle on feed state. Mm-hmm. But I wonder if we realize that we cannot maintain that level in our pork industry, our dairy industry, our hog industry.
Level of what, I'm sorry, of employment, or?
Well, if we lose the immigrant, especially the Latin American workers in our industry, and so it's going to be very difficult to go promote our beef in the end run if we don't have the workers either in the feedlots, the packing industry, and now poultry industry is growing very quickly. And I know you said it's very difficult to put numbers to the benefits. Are there any statistics out there that really can benefit us in the argument that we need immigrant workers to maintain our beef industry and be able to export our products in this state? And one other, if you would just make a comment regarding Congress has 5 months left to come up with any meaningful legislation on DACA, and then if they don't, the uncertainty of what's going to happen puts a lot of turmoil in our
university.
Yeah, all over.
All over.
So I guess if you would comment maybe statistically.
Let me start with the last one, because on the way up here, very early this morning from Lawrence, Kansas, we heard a story on NPR about how the Silicon Valley community, the high-tech industries, as well as Walmart and others, just met with the Judiciary Committee to essentially, given what I envision, what I imagine, because I know how these processes work, to give them a draft of the bill. We've worked these processes before, that they want, right? Mike Harper did it, remember, when Conagra was going to leave. Here's the draft, governor, pass it or I'm gone. So interestingly enough, the Silicon Valley has now become very active and essentially saying, we need these workers, we need to do this. When I heard the story this morning, I said to my husband who was driving, I guess that they know something that Governor Ricketts doesn't seem to know, which is, you need talent workers, you need skilled workers, and you're gonna get rid of this population that you've already invested in, that is vetted and focused on education. So very important to work on that. And the legislature has done a great job, and a lot of community groups and industry groups have done a great job in supporting that. There's tons of data on the need for immigrant workers or any workers, obviously, for meatpacking. I mean, the fact that they have had to rely 75% in proportion similar to the last century on immigrant workers tells you something. The agriculture as a whole, as you know, is encountering this problem. We have net zero immigration from Mexico. Net zero. I mean, the net migration is zero. That border is closing. Mexicans are beginning to enjoy an improvement in their economy. Mexico just built did you know this? Do you people who know meatpacking? The largest plant in the world, the largest meatpacking plant. When I started this work, I said in my chapter on From Columbus to Conagra, Mexico doesn't have the required inputs and so forth, so it's importing labor. Well, that has changed. So one thing is that beef production could disappear, and we'll be eating imported food, imported meats, or maybe just very high wage. What other parts of agriculture are doing, as you probably know, is trying to rely on H-2A visas or H-2B visas, which are agricultural or seasonal work visas. But the Trump administration has promised to eradicate all those visas as well. Meatpacking, as you saw, also relies on people on temporary protective service, protective status. And those are going to be gone as well. Meatpacking has relied on refugees. It looks like we're clamping down. So I'm not sure where that population is going to come from. Wages are not enough. So the other possibility is that communities get together with employers, and the industry undergoes, like it has done before, a major restructuring all over again. And we go local and we produce sustainable and small, in small scale. I don't know where that.
So I'm gonna jump in there with a little disclaimer. I think, first, Don, your point about tying workforce availability and workforce to economics is a reasonable approach, and I imagine if we talk with our labor statistics folks and ag economists that we probably could do some of that, but that's the point. I think the other thing I would say, with all due respect, and everyone is entitled to their opinions, had you listened to Fox News, you maybe would have gotten a different perspective than NPR. And I want to just publicly put that out so we have balance. I think the second thing that I would put out there is that there is no question that I think the governor's administration is thinking about jobs and job creation. And I want to stop the politics at that point, because I would say, again, we're all entitled to our perspective. And one of the things that happens, I think, in today's society is if we get too down that path, we lose sight that everyone in this room, I think, is a Nebraskan. And what we're really here about is thinking about how do we grow Nebraska from the lessons of our own past, the lessons around the globe, and how do we bring that back to our own communities. And to mark your question, up there on the screen, when we saw the increased shift in demographics from 1990 to 2000, and if we take a look, you can go to each of those communities, and you're a fifth generation Nebraskan, so you could do your own assessment as to which communities are actually moving the needle forward in constructive ways, and which communities are struggling, which have been in a good place and now find themselves in a divisive, difficult place, and which of those were in a divisive place and are actually finding solutions to move us forward. And the reality is that we're all humans, and we're all blessed and cursed by being imperfect. And so as a series of communities, how do we move forward? And I think today this is a beefy topic, and it's loaded. But I think being able...
And I was told I could be controversial.
Being able to sit...
that way you maintain your energy and you were awake.
By being able to have this conversation and to think about different perspectives and be challenged is a good, healthy thing. And how we move it forward is critical. We have one last comment or question, and then we have a gift for you, Lourdes.
Okay.
And then we'll wrap it up.
So thank you very much. I'm a faculty member in food science, a research professor, but I'm really from Washington State, and for the first time in many years,
Apples.
I went back to Yakima, Washington, and saw a relative, and the industry has changed markedly there, and a lot of the way that apple trees are grown has changed, and the way they're harvested has changed. And fruit industry and vegetable industry in this country depends a lot, or has, on migrants, cheap labor. And people are coming up with new and innovative ways. That doesn't mean you get to cut those jobs out, but maybe Nebraska needs to think a little more inventively about what agricultural products we have and we can learn to depend on. And that means that there would be new jobs and new techniques and new technology. And so probably that's an important thing. And as Mike just said, it's good if we can quit talking red state, blue state, or Democrat, Republican, and if we can figure out how to get them to talk together about moving Nebraska forward in a way that keeps people and agriculture important, that's a good thing.
And I think that, if I may say, this is...
You get the last word,
Yes,
Lourdes.
I get the last word. Well, because with all due respect, I also think that, not every news organization or think tank is as rigorous as academics in producing data. So I try to rely on news organizations that are just relying on research and just reporting what's going on. But I think that you are right. This is not a Republican or Democrat issue. It has become more of a extreme right sometimes versus everybody else. And this is what's happening in this conversation, because among all the people that I mentioned that are working very hard to provide this welcoming climate, many of them are Republicans, not just Democrats, or some of them are independents. So this is not a Republican-Democrat issue. You're right about that. Yeah.
And with that, I would like to, let's thank Lourdes one more time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you.
Thanks for a very provocative and informative summary of where we've been, where we are, and where we're heading. And I'd like to present you then with the Huerman Lecture Medal.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Everybody can
and
see it.
thank you for your time,
Thank you.
and thank you for stretching
Thank
us.
you, Mike.
Thank you very much.
Yes, okay. Thank you, everybody.